His star had really risen in Vietnam. He was really known as one of the leading doves. Of course, Watergate diminished the attention of a lot of people, including church.
It was right after Nixon had resigned because of the Watergate scandal. And Gerald Ford had become president and then immediately pardoned Nixon, which was unpopular. In the 1974 midterm elections, the Democrats won a landslide victory, 60 seats in the Senate, over 290 seats in the House. And then in December 1974, right after the election, the New York Times ran a major investigation of the CIA's domestic spying operations.
When Seymour Hersh first published the series about domestic spying, that really, as they say, brought it home. So like, wait a minute, you're looking, your foreign intelligence agencies looking at us, following us, wiretapping us. And, the more people began to find out about it, again, the angrier they got, which they realized right away they needed a committee to look into.
And that caused a firestorm of protest in the country and in Congress. Gerald Ford was trying to get on top of it and to slow down the congressional investigations. He had ideas coming from his deputy chief, who was a man named Dick Cheney, and his White House chief of staff, who was Donald Rumsfeld. And they came up with the idea of creating a presidential commission to investigate the CIA. It was called the Rockefeller Commission, which was named for the Vice President, Nelson Rockefeller. And what they clearly wanted to do was have a committee that would whitewash the problems and diffuse the congressional interest in investigations.
One of the reasons he really wanted the CIA investigation was he was not appointed to the Watergate Committee, and he lobbied Mike Mansfield very hard to become chair of the CIA investigation.
And so when Frank Church came in, he initially thought his investigation would be kind of like Watergate 2.0, that he would primarily be investigating Richard Nixon and his abuses of the CIA. But he very quickly found out that the history of presidential abuses of the CIA went back a couple decades. He had to be willing to investigate not only Nixon, but Johnson and Kennedy and Eisenhower. Kennedy had been a close friend of his. The Kennedy family was still very powerful in the Democratic Party at that time. And so it was courageous of him to go along and approve investigations of the Kennedy administration. He had actually two committees. One was an investigation of multinational corporations that was going on in parallel to the Church Committee, which investigated the CIA and the FBI.
It was the investigation of the multinational corporations. It started out looking at ITT's activities in Chile. Then the election of Salvador Allende, that threatened both ITT and it also threatened the CIA, that the socialist was now the president of Chile. And as it turned out, the CIA assisted Allende's opponents, and he ended up being assassinated. That was the tip of the iceberg. There was a scandal involving the royal family in Holland. Then there was a scandal involving the Prime Minister of Japan that brought down the Japanese government. That investigation was pretty weighty, overshadowed, I think, by Watergate and then the Church Committee. But squeezed between the Watergate Committee and the Church Committee was this very significant investigation. I think there was a link between all three of those investigations. The link was the abuse of power. Watergate was the abuse of power. The multinationals was the abuse of both private and public power. And then, of course, the Church Committee was the look at the abuse of the intelligence agencies across the board.
The result of his investigation of multinational corporations, including Lockheed and ITT, led to a ban on foreign bribery by American companies. It's a law that's still on the books called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
Most of the senators now agree with Chairman Frank Church that the CIA has indeed been a rogue elephant out of control. So the testimony of Colby didn't allay the suspicions. The hearings took place in the historic Senate caucus room, scene of the dramatic Watergate investigation just 2 years ago. As someone said, after what has happened in this country during the past 2 years, there are no more future shocks. But whether there are shocks or not, today's open hearing did focus major attention on the way the CIA has gone about its business in the United States.
The subject today concerns CIA's involvement in the development of bacteriological warfare materials with the Army's Biological Laboratory at Fort Detrick.
No question.
Have you brought with you some of those devices which would have enabled the CIA to use this poison for?
We have indeed.
For killing people? Don't point it at me. I wonder if...
Can you roll that over?
Roll it over. Now, does this pistol fire the dart?
Yes, it does, Mr. Chairman. The round thing at the top is obviously the sight. The rest of it is what is practically a normal 45, although it's special. However, it works by electricity. There's a battery in the handle, and it fires a small dart.
The dart gun that photo had an enormous impact on the image of Frank Church. It symbolizes how he was taking on the CIA directly in a way that no one else ever had. The main investigation by the Church Committee into the CIA, it focused on a plot by the CIA to work with the mafia to kill Fidel Castro. And they brought together an ad hoc group of U.S. mafia figures in Miami to work with the CIA. And it was kind of like Ocean's 11. It's all these weird people coming together. John Kennedy knew what was going on with the CIA and the mafia. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, was trying to investigate the CIA for their ties to the mafia. Some of the mobsters, they didn't want to succeed at killing Castro because they had a lot of casinos in Havana for the Cuban Revolution. They wanted to see if they could get back in there with Castro. There were a bunch of different plots that never went anywhere, like having his hair fall out, having a wetsuit that was poisoned. And so the main way they were trying to kill him was with a poison pill, which they delivered to the mafia. The person the mafia got in Havana who was close to him lost his nerve and never delivered it.
So you had some really heavyweight people on that committee, everywhere from Gary Hart to a Barry Goldwater. Church had to hold that whole team together. One of the things he was always criticized for was he compromised too fast, compromised too much, because he knew that the final product would be stronger with compromise, especially if it was a bipartisan decision. We could learn a lot about that in today's politics, of course.
The Bureau went so far as to mail anonymous letters to Dr. King and his wife, which were mailed shortly before he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and finishes with this suggestion. King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You have just 34 days in which to do it. This exact number has been selected for a specific reason. It has definite practical significance. It was 34 days before the award. You are done.
Well, right after I made that statement, Fritz Mondale, who was really the hero of the committee on the FBI side, everybody was a hero, but he was a special one. He asked me a question.
If I can interrupt, that was taken by Dr. King to mean a suggestion for suicide, was it not?
That's our understanding, Senator.
And the answer was, it was intended, and it was taken as an effort by the King family and the King associates like Andy Young to get him to commit suicide. Hoover hated King. J. Edgar Hoover hated King. Hoover had a negative view of what were then called Negroes. Indeed, on the very afternoon of King's I Have a Dream speech in Washington, D.C., in the bowels of the FBI's office, they resolved to destroy Martin Luther King. And they set out to do that in lots of ways. They persuaded the Kennedy brothers to agree to wiretapping of King and King's close associates. They did that, we later discovered, by exaggerating the role of an advisor to King, his closest white advisor, Stanley Levison, who had been a member of the Communist Party, but who left the party and the party turned against him. But what the FBI told John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy was that he was a member of the Communist Party and a close advisor of King, and they wanted to get the wiretaps. They then obtained, or they didn't have to obtain permission. Under the rules then, the FBI could put a bug in anybody's house, in anybody's bedroom, and they put bugs in hotel rooms that King was going to use, and they made recordings from that and then sent those to King with the letter. Just one final thought that may be helpful. We obviously focused very much on the CIA and very much on the FBI and a lot on other institutions like the NSA. My own view, and I remember mentioning this to the committee at some time, was that the CIA was a danger to the country because its successes undermined the reputation of the United States in the world, but that the FBI was a danger to the country because its efforts undermined democracy in America. And both of those things one should be worried about, but I thought that the effort to undermine democracy in America was the more dangerous. And so my personal view is that our hearings on the FBI were the most important work we did. Other people might not agree with that, but they certainly were enormously important.
The National Security Agency was created in 1952, but it was never investigated. There was no congressional oversight of it. People in Congress didn't even want to know anything about it because it was considered so secretive.
The hearing will please come to order. This morning, the committee begins public hearings on the National Security Agency, or as it is more commonly known, the NSA. We have a particular obligation to examine the NSA in light of its tremendous potential for abuse. It has the capacity to monitor the private conversations of American citizens without the use of a bug or a tap. The interception of international communication signals sent through the air is the job of NSA, and thanks to modern technological developments, it does its job very well. The danger lies in the ability of the NSA to turn its awesome technology against domestic communications. Indeed, as our hearings into the Houston Plan demonstrated, a previous administration and a former NSA director favored using this potential against certain U.S. citizens for domestic intelligence purposes.
The work that I was engaged in with my colleagues on that task force were primarily the National Security Agency, investigating Shamrock and Minaret, two very important programs that they conducted, with the watch lists and the interception of every single telegram that came into the United States. We did a lot on the war protest side because of NSA. There were 1,600 names on that watch list, many of which were anti-war folks.
Our investigation has revealed that the NSA had in fact been intentionally monitoring the overseas communication of certain U.S. citizens long before the Houston Plan was proposed, and continued to do so after it was revoked.
If it's involved in an American, you can't just willy-nilly take what's coming in. So this is very rudimentary back then. But Frank Church saw this, and he knew how devastating this would be.
This incident illustrates how the NSA could be turned inward and used against our own people.
Jane Fonda comes in, boom, you got her telegram. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was one of the remedies that came out of this investigation, it was to say, hey, folks, you can't do this without a warrant.
And that investigation directly resulted in the enactment of FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And it was the first time that any restrictions had been imposed on the intelligence community to listen into communications of American citizens.
The dominant concern of this committee is the intrusion by the federal government into the inalienable rights guaranteed Americans by the Constitution. In previous hearings, we have seen how these rights have been violated by the intelligence services of the CIA, the FBI, and the IRS. As the present hearings will reveal, the NSA has not escaped the temptation to have its operations expanded into provinces protected by the law.
Minaret was a term that began in 1969, and as we described, somewhat formalized the process by which these messages were handled, which had begun apparently about 1967.
Now, in the initial communication on Minaret, is it true that one of the equally important aspects of Minaret was not to disclose that NSA was doing this?
That appears in the documentation regarding it, yes.
And what was the reason for not disclosing to the other intelligence agencies? Because this information only went to other intelligence agencies. Well, what was the reason for not disclosing to the other intelligence agencies who were the consumers that NSA was not doing this?
It's hard for me to really answer because I'm not exactly sure as to what was the feeling of people at the time. This material was handled in such a way as to minimize the possibility that it would be used in that fashion.
What has occurred yesterday could occur tomorrow if we leave it all to executive decision. Now, as I have said, as to one of these, the watch list, the administration agreed to declassify the documents and authorize General Allen to testify as he has. As to the other, the executive branch has consistently opposed public hearings or any other form of public disclosure.
If you have a J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI, if you have somebody in charge of NSA who isn't spending a lot of their time on foreign stuff, if you had a president of the United States who decided it was their personal fiefdom, the Justice Department and the intelligence agencies under their personal supervision, this is tyranny. This is an abyss from which, as Frank Church said, there might be no return. One of the things discovered in 2013, some Freedom of Information Act requests, is that there were two very important names that were left off that watch list when it was given to us. One was Howard Baker, who was on the committee, who was also a member of the Watergate Committee. And the second name was Frank Church's, which is just, to me and to everybody who found this out, of course, terribly shocking. Had those two names of committee members been known to us as staff people or known to the committee, I can guarantee you all hell would have broken loose at the White House, at the CIA, at the NSA, at the FBI, everywhere. Hold on, you are looking at the two people who were on this committee. So maybe we were a little young and naive back then, but I thought we were pretty much getting the straight scoop on a lot of this. No, not really. We weren't.